Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The hands of Yulia Ivanovna Belov have grown numb with age and labor. They're hands that have performed the arduous rhythms of life in a small Russian village, and as they have done so, become themselves an evocation of the cycle of birth, life, and death as it occurs in Solovyovo. What has been done by these hands and those that have joined with them forms part of the generations of shared experience that is the history, tradition, and memory of the village. And in that memory is enshrined the beliefs of Solovyovo's people about the world they inhabit and the world of wonders beyond. To learn of the story of memory in this one Russian village is to gain insight into the meaning of Russia herself and of the greater human condition that embraces us all. My guest is Margaret Paxson, author of Solovyovo, The Story of Memory in a Russian Village. The photographs for this book were taken by Lucian Perkins. Margaret Paxson, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you for having me.
It's a delight, especially a delight after reading this book, Maggie, and I'd love to go right to the essence, if you will, the meaning of this book. As a reader, it struck me powerfully as a very human story, and a very complex one, obviously about memory, and at least in part, to me, about the way people use the landmarks of memory as a way of defining who they are. But there's much more to it, and I think your answer is much more important than mine. What do you attempt to do with a book like this?
Well, I'm an anthropologist, and what anthropologists sort of believe is that by slowly and quietly looking at one place and engaging one place and understanding intimately one place, you can draw broader perspectives about larger settings. And so I lived in this one place to try to understand Russia close up. When I went to the village, I didn't mean to write about memory. I meant to write about how people imagined their past. I wanted to gather stories about people's lives, which was interesting enough as it was, and just hear about them talk about the revolution, et cetera, et cetera. But what I ended up doing and what I ended up seeing was that there was a tremendous amount of the past that was reproduced in the present.
Absolutely.
In other words, people were remembering what came before. And this was a broader question. It also meant something to me in the context of Russia per se.
Right.
Because in Russia, people were expecting quick changes.
You know, I appreciate that answer very much, Maggie, and it's very clear this book is a product of, let's say, a lived experience. I mean, that's really the essence of it. It's also striking to me, and I'm glad you decided to focus on memory as you have done, just how intricate this whole issue of memory is. For example, the memories that make up the collective memory include things war and suffering, joy, religion, politics, and nature itself. I mean, it's just extraordinary. They're all intertwined.
I didn't want to do a study that sort of only looked at a certain kind of past, like a political past, a kind of past that might be meaningful to us. I wanted to look at a kind of a view of memory that included, as you said, all of these different kinds of lived experiences. Everything from birth and love and joy, but also despair and suffering and death.
Yeah.
So I wanted to include all of those sides of things.
You succeeded. Take it from me, you succeeded. And one of the reasons you succeeded, Maggie Paxson, is that you yourself became part of this village. And now I want to go to the method that you employed because it fascinates me as a reader. I said earlier it's a lived experience. You lived it with Yulia Ivanova Belov and her husband Mikhail Alexeyev.
Yes, Mikhail Alexeyevich. Yes.
Alexeyevich Belov. And this maybe to cut right to the point on this is what fascinates me. You had to, and you very obviously did develop an emotional connection with them, and them with you.
Yes.
And by extension, the villagers. But at the same time, and here's to me what the magic of the book is, you had to maintain a certain kind of scholarly objectivity about it. Yeah. Now, how do you do that?
I don't know.
Actually,
it's a huge puzzle. It's, I mean, it is the paradox of my field. You both need to engage in a place, and well, I feel that you need to be a part of that place. For me, it was essential. It's just the kind of thinker and person that I am, that I needed to feel like that was my place, but also the constant tension of trying to stand out and look and listen with very particular ears and eyes. It's a very big challenge. I've been going over some of my I had about 20 journals, a stack this high of journals while I was there, trying to pay attention, trying to absorb every different kind of aspect of life, you know. And you're doing that while living through this, while people are, you know, living painful things,
right.
and it's very challenging. So the answer is I don't know, but I think it's a good thing to try to do, to try to both be engaged and detached.
Well, and again, you know, I read this as someone who's reading it for the first time, of course, but I think you succeeded in both those things, and I guess there is a magic to it, and perhaps one can't question it very closely or at risk of losing it altogether. One of the great qualities of this book also, Maggie, I'm sure you would agree, are the wonderful photographs that Lucian Perkins contributed, which really do complement the text marvelously. I'd love to turn to them now and then later in our conversation as well, just to give viewers a sense of just how beautiful they are and their meaning. And I'd love to hear you explain them as we do so.
Absolutely.
And the first one is this very lovely picture of a very lovely woman, and I think this indeed is the Yulia.
This is Yulia. This is actually the only photograph that we have today that was not taken by Lucian Perkins, who came and visited the village several times. This is the woman that I lived with in her youth. It's the first day she came to live in the village of Solovyovo, the village that I've called Solovyovo. And it's the day that she met the man that she was to marry.
One of the things that, well, you know, without trying to be overly interpretive, but there she is, you know, sitting in nature, so to speak.
Yes.
And one of the real powerful messages of this book, to me, again, was how integrated nature is in the lives of the people of Solovyovo. Yeah.
That was extraordinary for me. I've lived in cities my whole life, and for me this would have been a new experience in the United States, living in a small village in the United States. But in Russia, they're so close still to the land in this setting. Farming is so unmechanized. So everything that you create, everything that you well, not everything that you eat, but most everything that you eat and produce comes out of that land, and you have to pay attention to the rules of the weather, the rules of the soil, in order to exist.
You know, you make that point several times in the book. There's an agrarian calendar that is fundamental to the Russian reality. And Rodino, is that the word?
Rodina.
Rodina.
Yes,
we'll work on it. But the land itself is a personage in Russian lives. I mean, it's very powerful. And well, in fact, let's look at this picture, because here you have, well, you tell me what we have.
Well, this is actually the group of us walking back. In the summer, there's a big job at hand in order to feed the animals that you keep in your home. We had a cow in my home and some sheep, and you have hay grows, you have to cut the hay, and you have to transport the hay, and it takes a couple months in this village to do this work by hand. Mikhail Alexeyevich is carrying a scythe, and Yulia is carrying a rake. And these are the kinds of instruments that we would use, you know, day in and day out for weeks on end. This is the kind of job that could be done here in a matter of days.
Yeah. This is the mid-90s, too, we should point out.
So. Yes, exactly.
Where they're headed, and the next image I want us to look at is, in fact, one of my very favorites. I think it's actually Sinokos.
Yes.
A word that has enormous power. It refers to the hay harvest, but it's much more than that, isn't it, Maggie?
Well, absolutely. This is actually, you're seeing this this process of the hay cutting at its culmination. What you're producing is this huge stack of hay that can then be transported into the village. But it requires the man standing on the top of that haystack is probably in his 70s, and he's the patriarch of his family, and his children and his grandchildren have all gathered together in the summer to do this work together. And this kind of represents the importance and the place of the extended family, and how it comes together in efforts like this, and then also how the fruits of that labor goes back out into the communities of villages and towns.
Indeed, we're going to touch on that whole question of extended family, and before that, though, I want to stay on this the whole issue of the land and the importance of agriculture, because much of the land of Russia is very poor.
Oh yes.
Very poor for agriculture.
Yes.
So it's a very harsh existence right from the start.
Well, the north in particular, where I was, there are only 4 months of the year that you can grow, really, you can grow plants. And in much of the other parts of the world, like here, you have far more time. And so the effort that you have to put into growing things here in terms of labor becomes much, much more intense there. And the land is bad, and so you have to do all this work, and when you don't have mechanized farming, the effort is just tremendously big.
Another realization, Maggie, another lesson of the many that I learned from your book, is the very, well, let's say that the role of the villager or peasant in Russian society is pretty well, contradictory, I think, in at least in one sense. There's I think you have a Robert Conquest quote in this book that points it up, that the intelligentsia of Russia has kind of a dual image of people like the villagers of Solovyovo. On the one hand, they're the soul of the country.
Yes.
On the other hand, they're just sort of looked down on.
Yes, absolutely. This was actually very difficult for me to handle before I ever went there, because people were telling me, urbanites were telling me, if you go to the village, they're going to be drunken, it's going to be a mess, it's going to be horrible, they're going to cheat you, they're going to kill you, you know, it's going to be terrible. And then other people were telling me, oh, how all this beautiful stuff was there and all the soul of Russia's there. And in fact, reality is so much deeper and more interesting than that dichotomy. At the same time, it demonstrates a lack of continuity in that society where elites, urban elites, and in the urban intelligentsia is so far removed from so much of Russia. It's such a different world.
Yeah.
And that's important in a much broader context, because when looking at this Russia, you know, that other Russia that everybody talks about here in Washington is so different.
I think that's one of the greatest strengths of the book, quite frankly. And let's turn that into some interpretations of language that might help us understand it. For example, this distance you just spoke of, and for the villagers, I think it equates to being to the terms of those who are of us, one of us, and then those who are outsiders.
Right.
And on this question of who's an outsider, what's that word, chuzoi?
Chuzoi, exactly.
Chuzoi, that's not too bad for me. But chuzoi, it's interesting because they could obviously be foreigners, such as if I went there, I'd be a chuzoi, obviously. But also urbanites and even bureaucrats, is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole system of, well, this is a big anthropological question. How do societies figure out who belongs and who doesn't belong, and what kind of boundaries there are between those two sets of groups? And those who are one's own get certain kinds of treatment, and those who are outsiders get other kinds of treatment. And yes, in certain ways of thinking about this. Sometimes everyone in the country is swoi, but sometimes outsiders are chuzoi, and that means they're frightening.
The reverse of that, of course, is the word I think which you might have just used, svoi, which is of the village, of the family, of the group. And this, of course, it's not just people, is it? It's traditions and customs can be svoi?
Well, the word svoi is a very broad word. It means, you know, that one's own. So it doesn't have to just be a person, but generally speaking, socially speaking, yes, it's all different kinds of groups of all different kinds of sizes. So actually, when I returned to the village after not having been there for a couple of years when I was writing my dissertation. You
had to work your way back.
Yeah, they said, "Oh, you've become one's own completely." And they used that word for me. I was so touched by that. But I could also be in other ways foreign. I could be chuzoi under other circumstances, and other foreigners could be as well.
That is absolutely fascinating. So. And then, of course, there's the term rod.
Rod.
For family.
It's the family line, yes.
And again, the word for land?
This land, the motherland, as we translate it, Rodina, is a very important word in Russian, not just in the village context. In the village, Rodina is my land where I was born, where my ancestors are buried, where my ancestors are buried as well. It's that land that's imbued with one's people.
Right.
In that word, though, is also Rodina in Russia at large, is used as the motherland, as Mother Russia. And Russians, when they're feeling patriotic about their country, their country is their Rodina.
It's their Rodina.
Yeah, it's a warm word.
It even sounds warm.
Yeah.
Again, let's go to some of the photographs of Lucian Perkins, just to get a more graphic understanding of this. This first one is emblematic. Well, it looks to me like plowing, but it's much more than plowing, perhaps.
Yes, this is the potato plant. This was Lucian's first trip. I love this picture because it really gives a sense of the vastness of that sky. And the sky plays such an important role because what's happening in the sky decides what will happen on the land. And it was warm enough and it was time to plant the potatoes. And,
right.
And so that's what this man is doing just a couple houses down from where I live.
I was struck by how much revolves not just around the seasons of, obvious agrarian seasons of planting and harvesting, but the potato itself.
Yeah.
And the harvest of the potato.
Yes.
Well, first of all, planting potatoes is a communal thing,
yes.
isn't it?
Yeah, this is actually the one task during the year that where villagers actually work together. It is the famous Russian collective actually happens in this setting where they help each other. Actually, it's a timing issue. They need to use the horses together. So these are neighbors in this picture. The woman standing she lives half the year in the village and half the year in the city, and they're all helping each other. This is a big job.
You know, there's another image here, the next one, which there it is. Look at that. Those are potatoes together. This is in the house.
Yes, yes. This is the house where I lived that had been taken over by potatoes that were going to be seed. They were seed potatoes, so they were sitting out in the house to prepare them for planting. And the cat in the window is Kisa. She's looking out the window, which is what she did a lot. But yes, these potatoes took over our home. The job takes over your life, you know, for a while. And this is a one-room home basically that was sort of partitioned a little bit. But three of us lived in that home, and everything. So everything that we did, we sort of, you know, knew about.
If I'm not mistaken, we have another shot of Kisa. There she is. Is that Kisa?
That's somebody else's Kisa.
Yeah,
that's somebody
like
else's cat. This is a neighbor's home, and she's weaving a rug, which is actually a traditional sort of kind of.
You know, the fact that she's weaving that rug is important too, because is it correct, Maggie, that money is not used really in Solovyovo? She's probably weaving that for her own use or for barter or something?
Well, the money is used to a certain extent, but in an important way, and people don't. They do a lot of economic activity happens without money, put it that way. So money is sort of, as you implied, money is there, but it's for the extras. And so she's making a rug for herself,
right.
Yeah, or maybe for a friend or a neighbor. She's probably not going to be selling that rug. But yeah, the absence of money, the relative absence of money in the village is a really important. Is a really important side to village life, because during the 90s, when money was a huge problem in Russia, the village actually ended up being a place where people were relatively protected and safe from the fluctuations of the economic cycle. So they had their food, they had the basics for survival, which is more than you could say for some people in other settings.
You know, talking about the meaning of money reminds me of something else I very much want to get your comment on, because the meaning of things, the meaning of values between one culture and another is very powerfully brought forth. It's a comment. It's a description of the view of freedom that these villagers would have, and I'll quote directly a sentence or two. Freedom, quotes, means the West taking hegemonic control in the same way that other conquering nations bring in their damned languages and customs. America, it is felt by many, has colonized with its damned freedom. But freedom, when it means do whatever you want, is dangerous, not only because of its way of loosening up the frames of order, but because in the stretches of its borrowed meanings, it marks national humiliation. I think that really hits home.
Yeah, the word for freedom in Russian is svoboda, and that's an old and big word, like our word freedom. It's a beautiful word. It means the kind of feeling that you have outside, you know, when there's an openness and there's a connectedness. But there's another meaning of this freedom that was brought in the West after the fall of the Soviet Union, and this is actually a very kind of subtle and layered question. But it's very true that one side of that word, svoboda, as it was brought in by Americans, came to take on a negative connotation, sadly enough, because it was associated in the minds of Russians with the bad things that they saw coming into their culture, like violent movies, licentious behavior, all kinds of behavior that is more like what animals do than what they see as people doing. I think the main point is that we have to be very careful when we import things. And something that is as beautiful a notion as the notion of freedom, when we send it out into the world, we don't necessarily know what's going to come back, especially if we're also sending out, let's say, you know, ugly, violent movies and ugly, violent behavior.
Right.
And this is going to be something that people are going to react to in their own ways, and we have to be careful.
Well, let me just say, Maggie, I think that alone is worth the price of the book. Because, I mean, there is anthropology that is of very direct use for all of us, something for all of us to think about, and I thank you for it, quite frankly, putting that in the book. I want to discuss, even briefly, even with the statement, well, there's so many concepts in here that we have no chance of getting to because they are all so rich. But the notion of the radiant past fascinated me.
Yeah.
This is like time out of time. This is the village's memory of a kind of a Brigadoon or Camelot or Shangri-La. I mean, everything all mixed together when things were all better than they are now.
Yeah. This was something that I had to deal with. I had to, and I think many people who've spent time in Russia have noticed that people spend a lot of time there saying, God, life was really, really better before, and then everything collapsed, and now it's a lot worse. It's terrible now. And it's so surprising because we know so much now of how awful it was. There were all these terrible wars, and there were these terrible repressions.
Right.
And yet, there's this feeling about the past that it was somehow brighter and better.
Well, you know, it's interesting how things get interpreted. There's another lovely word, Kozhan. Kozhan?
Khazyan, yes.
It means more than boss or ruler, but it has that at its core. And I found that in the book that people would nostalgically apply that to Stalin, and even if they didn't care for communism, and even if they thought the apparatchiks and the others were pretty awful, still the father figure, you know, was part of the radiant past.
Well, one of these things that I would see a lot of times, people would, in passing, say comments about Stalin that, you know, he wasn't so bad. You know, he created order and he created discipline. And when I dug into that, this is actually quite complicated because those same people in other contexts would understand very well that this period was horrific, and there were repressions in the village, there were arrests in this village. It was, but what they're talking about in the search for this Khazyan type figure, this leader type figure, which is, I think, applicable today, is someone who can create order when there is chaos. And one of the dangers that they feel about the world today is that is imbued with this chaos that's going to go careening out.
Spinning out of control.
Spinning out of control. And actually, in some ways, they were right in the 90s that there was a lot of social chaos. And so this idea that it is the ruler's duty to cap things and bring them together is very prominent there.
It's the wish for order.
The wish for order, yes.
Again, let's look at some of the images of, isn't this lovely? This reminds me in the summer, the population, which is generally only about 33 aging people, expands. A lot of young, these are obviously young attractive kids.
Yes.
Helping with what?
They're gathering berries. These are probably raspberries. Actually, they're right by the lake. Yeah, these are three of the many granddaughters of this one family, and they would come every summer. And now they're all lovely young women. And on my first visit there, we'd spend actually a good amount of time together. The kids come, they help out, they do chores. But they also get to be children, which is really wonderful. They play in the water, they play in the forest. The girls, you know, gossip and they sing songs and they do play games, and yeah, it's really a refreshing thing to see, sort of children getting to be children.
I would say that's idyllic.
Yeah.
The next couple of images are quite not so idyllic, quite frankly.
It would be a huge mistake to sort of paint this world as just idyllic. Is
this the young man who seeks out Mikhail, Yulia's husband, to have him do some sorcery?
He has in the past. This is Mikhail Alexeyevich, Yulia's husband, is a local healer, and he uses kinds of more traditional healing practices for his healing, but oftentimes he would get people who had problems with alcohol and other sort of what we would consider more psychological problems.
I think there's one point, there's a young man who's a veteran in the Chechnya conflict who comes and is really he's drunk actually, I think he's disturbed.
Yeah, he comes and he wants to kill himself because he says what he had to do when he was in Chechnya, and his brother had killed himself, and he wanted to talk to Mikhail Alexeyevich.
I just say that that photo is so beautiful, it looks like three dimensions. And then, but finally, look at this image. Now here, this is a very different mood.
Yes, this is on, I write about this holiday. One of my chapters in the book is about the calendar, the very rich calendar that includes all kinds of different elements from, you know, the Christian life and Soviet life and agrarian life. And this is called a gulyanka on a festival called Ilyin Din, which is one day in the summer. And as in traditional village setting, they're playing the the accordion, they're singing, and they're doing this kind of dancing, it's stomping around, and they're doing this walk. And traditionally, kids would do this and walk from village to village and meet each other and sometimes fall in love that way. And it was one of the mechanisms for getting to know each other, and it's still alive today in a somewhat different form, but it's there.
You know what I loved about this book, and just to focus on this image a bit longer, the Gulianka can get pretty raucous and profane.
Yeah.
I got the impression, but it completes the cycle.
Yes.
Because the sacred and the profane seem to be pretty much intertwined, just like the seasons of life.
Yeah.
And what these, I hate to use the word earthy, but it's the only one that comes to mind because it just represents people who do relate to the earth and the seasons and are quite marvelous because of it. That's quite an image.
Yes, yes. This is a sort of a summer culmination. And traditionally, folklorists, some famous folklorists have talked about how the cycle of the year works and what it's about and what these festivals are about, these sort of crazy, wild festivals. And they can get kind of crazy and wild. Even when I was there, fights happen and there's sort of other stuff happens.
Well, some of those fights are pretty horrible.
Yeah, they're pretty horrible. I mean, luckily I didn't see any horrible fights, but there were some terrible ones. But there's sort of love, and, you know, romance and all kinds of stuff like that.
Well, Maggie, as we come to the end of a marvelous conversation that I think does justice to this fine book, thanks to you. This question, for the briefest of answers, just a word or two, which is unfortunate in a way because it deserves its own volume. You know, what kind of lessons should we take away from this? And I read this and I thought of something told to me by one of the architects of the Vietnam War.
Oh my goodness.
And this man told me in a very moving passage once, he said, you know, our biggest failure was this: we didn't have empathy.
Yeah.
And as I read this book, I wondered, is that what this kind of book gives us?
You know, that's funny you should say that, because for me, I think there was always something in the undercurrent of what I was trying to do. And I think really what it was trying to do was look at a place that the outside world, both in Russia and in broader, thought was just ugly and broken and dirty and dark. And by shedding light on it, show that it actually has complexity and beauty.
With Maggie Paxson. So. I think you did that.
Thank you very much, George.
Thank you very much. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue at wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching.